Today, we're digging into the life of a truly formidable figure from the 20th century, Dr. Abraham T. Kovoor. He was a man driven by a single, relentless mission. And his story, well, it's one of just unwavering conviction.
And this is the man himself. For decades, his work earned him these passionate followers who saw him as a liberator of the mind. And, on the other hand, fierce critics who saw him as a threat to tradition. With Dr. Kovoor, there really was no middle ground. His entire life was a declaration of war on irrationality.
And this quote, wow, it just gets right to the heart of it. A crusader against superstition and obscurantism. And obscurantism, by the way, is just a fancy word for deliberately keeping people in the dark, preventing facts from becoming known. His battlefield was the human mind, and his enemy, any belief that couldn't stand up to cold, hard, scientific scrutiny.
So what forges a man like that? A crusader against superstition? To really get a handle on his lifelong battle, we have to go right back to the beginning. Let's take a look at the moments that turned a boy born into a world of faith into a man who would be defined by reason.
So Kovoor's journey started inside a devout Christian family. But as he got older, he started to see his religion, his language, his entire culture as basically accidents of birth. He felt that once he was old enough to really think for himself, he had to discard his family's faith. He chose a new path, and that path was rationalism. And you can see this independent, fiery spirit pop up really early on. This slide sets the stage for a story from his boyhood that tells you everything you need to know. He was with his family's servant, Kunhiraman, and they had to cross a river. But on the ferry was a high-caste Brahmin, and he was deeply offended by the presence of a so-called untouchable. So the situation gets really tense. The Brahmin, totally bound by this rigid caste superstition, is demanding that Kunhiraman can't be on the boat. Now here's the kicker. The Brahmin himself couldn't swim, and he couldn't operate the ferry. So what do you think the young, already defiant Kovoor did next? He took direct, and I mean dramatic, action. With the Brahmin flailing in the water, Kovoor immediately turns to his servant, Kunhiraman, who happened to be an expert swimmer, and orders him to save the very man who had just declared him unclean. I mean, that one act just shows you everything. His contempt for dogma and his flair for these theatrical, very practical lessons. And this scientific mindset, it wasn't just for show, it was personal. When his sister got sick, she took her medicine, but she also prayed. Kovoor, ever the empiricist, just pointed out the logical flaw. He's like, how are we supposed to know what worked if you don't isolate the variables? For him, evidence was everything. Okay, so as he got older, his private skepticism really blossomed into a full-blown public mission. He started actively confronting beliefs right out there in the arena of ideas. And he never, ever backed down, not even when he was at his most vulnerable. I mean, picture this. It's 1959. Kovoor is laid up in a hospital, suffering from a massive heart attack. The Bishop of Colombo himself comes to his bedside, offering comfort, offering prayer. For anyone else, this is a moment of crisis. For Kovoor, it's a test of his principles. His response was instant and just so blunt. He flat out refused the prayer, insisting that any credit for his recovery had to go to the doctors and the science that they were practicing. Even staring down his own mortality, he would not give a single inch to the supernatural. And this wasn't some one-off thing. He actively sought out these kinds of confrontations. He once accepted a dinner invitation that he knew was basically a setup for a debate with some Pentecostalist leaders. Their main argument was that if you have true faith, you refuse medicine and you trust only in God to heal you. And this just highlights this fundamental clash of worldviews. The Pentecostalists are arguing that disease is God's will and medicine is basically improper interference. Kovoor just flips their logic completely on its head with one simple, powerful question. If medical science, a human creation, can thwart God's plan, well, doesn't that make humanity more powerful than God? Now, it was through decades of confrontations just like that one, public debates, investigations, articles, that he created what people started calling the Kovoor phenomenon. His work was just incredibly broad. He used what he called on-the-spot personal probes to investigate pretty much everything, from astrology to so-called miracles. And he wasn't just debunking ideas for the fun of it. He really focused on cases where he believed these superstitions were causing real psychological harm to people. And this is so key to understanding the guy. He wasn't some academic sitting in an ivory tower. He saw his work as a practical social mission.
His main targets were people he called intellectual cheats, those he believed were exploiting the fears and hopes of vulnerable people just to make a buck. And a huge part of his success was just his personal charisma. By all accounts, the man was a masterful communicator. With this magnetic personality and his clear, convincing arguments, he could hold an entire audience in the palm of his hand, making these really complex ideas feel both accessible and urgent. So, after an entire lifetime of intellectual combat, what was the final philosophy that really drove him? What was it all about? Well, people who studied his life pretty much all agree he was the embodiment of something called scientific humanism. It's a philosophy that, simply put, rejects the supernatural and instead puts its faith in our ability, humanity's ability, to solve our own problems using reason and science. That idea just perfectly captures his life's work. And he lived by those principles right to the very, very end. In his final act, he made his own body a tool for science and for humanity. His body was given to a medical college for research, and his eyes were donated, giving the gift of sight to 2 blind men. It was the ultimate statement of a life that was dedicated to practical human welfare over any spiritual promises. Which brings us to one last thought. Dr. Kovoor fought his battles against superstition back in the 20th century. But when you look at our world today, a world just saturated with misinformation, it leaves us with a really pressing question. What is the role of a crusading rationalist like him now? What does his legacy really mean for us?